My wife left me because I was broke. She said I was comfortable, average, going nowhere. What she didn't know was where 2 years of my paychecks had actually been going, until she watched me walk across her graduation stage and heard them say my name. My name is Jude Brooks. I'm 34 years old, and I work as an underwriter for a mid-sized insurance firm in Denver. Nobody claps when you tell them that at a dinner party. I spend my days reading risk the way other men read box scores, premiums, probabilities, the fine print nobody bothers to check until it's too late. It's not a job that turns heads. It's a job that pays quietly, if you're patient enough to let it. I was married to Stephanie for 8 years. She was finishing her nursing degree the year everything came apart, and I want to be honest about something before I go any further. I saw it coming before she said a word. Not because I'm perceptive. Because 6 months earlier, I'd sold my motorcycle and traded my truck for something older, something plainer, and I never told her why. That decision sits at the center of everything that happens in this story, and I promise you by the end, you'll understand exactly what it bought. My father lost almost everything in 2009. I was 17, and I watched him try to buy back my mother's respect with money he didn't have, right up until there wasn't a marriage left to save. He taught me one thing without meaning to: never let anyone watch you keep score. I built my entire adult life around that lesson. Quietly. Privately. Almost too privately, as it turned out. The night this story really begins, I was standing in a parking garage near my office, the concrete slick from an early snow, streetlights bleeding orange across wet asphalt. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. A message from Stephanie: "We need to talk when you get home." I remember standing there a full minute before I moved. Not because I didn't know what was coming. Because some part of me already knew this wasn't really about the marriage. It was about something I'd been building behind her back for 2 years, and she had no idea it existed. I got home to find Stephanie sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop closed and her arms crossed, which was never a good sign. She didn't yell. She never yelled. She just said, in this flat, tired voice, that her classmate Priya's husband had just bought a lake house in Steamboat Springs, and that she was tired of being the one who had to explain why we still drove a 12-year-old Camry. "I'm not asking for a lake house," she said. "I'm asking why you're so comfortable being average." That word, comfortable, she said it like an accusation, not a compliment. I remember gripping my coffee mug hard enough that my knuckles went white, because I wanted to tell her the truth right then. I wanted to say, I'm not comfortable, I'm careful, and there's a difference. But I'd made a promise to myself a long time ago, back when I was 17 and watching my father unravel, that I would never let money become a scoreboard in my house. So I said nothing. I let her think what she wanted. She stood up and walked out of the kitchen mid-sentence, the way she'd started doing more often that year, like finishing a conversation with me wasn't worth her time anymore. I sat there alone for a long while after she left the room, staring at the calendar on our fridge. Her clinical rotations circled in blue, a scholarship deadline for the university's simulation lab circled in red, a deadline only I knew the significance of. I thought about my father again, the year everything fell apart. He used to sit at our kitchen table doing exactly what I was doing now. Staring at numbers, saying nothing, hoping silence would hold a marriage together. It never did for him. I told myself it would be different for me, that my silence was strategy, not fear. Looking back, I'm not sure I believed that even then. Upstairs, I heard her moving boxes out of the closet, 3 weeks before she'd even said the word separation out loud. Stephanie moved out on a Tuesday, which felt like an oddly ordinary day for something so final. She stayed with her sister in Aurora, 20 minutes away, close enough that I kept expecting her to come back for something she forgot and never did. She left her wedding ring on the kitchen counter, next to the fruit bowl, like it belonged there with the bananas and the junk mail. Word got back to me through mutual friends that she'd started describing our marriage a certain way, that I was not ambitious, that I'd stopped trying, that she'd given her best years to a man who was content to stay still while the world moved around him. I didn't correct any of it. Correcting it would have meant explaining, and explaining would have meant showing my hand 2 years too early. Here's what nobody knew, not even Stephanie. Since I was 24, I'd been quietly investing every spare dollar I made, first in index funds, later in something more specific, an anonymous scholarship fund at the university where she was finishing her nursing degree. The motorcycle money, the truck money, all of it had gone into an equipment upgrade for the school's clinical simulation lab. I'd structured it through a shell entity with a lawyer I trusted, specifically so my name would never attach to it. I didn't do it to be a saint. I did it because 11 years earlier, a professor at that same program had mentored me through my own night classes when I was trying to break into underwriting with no connections and no money, and I'd promised myself I'd pay that forward someday, quietly, without an audience. 3 days after Stephanie left, standing alone in our half-empty house, I felt my phone buzz. An unfamiliar number. The message read, "She doesn't know yet, does she?" I stood there in the hallway, boxes stacked around me like evidence of something ending, and felt something cold settle in my chest. Someone knew. And I had no idea who, or how much. I didn't recognize the number, but I recognized the tone immediately, someone who knew exactly what they were dangling in front of me. I almost didn't respond. Then curiosity, or maybe dread, got the better of me, and I typed back a single word, "Who is this?" The reply came fast. "Camille. From Fort Collins, junior year. I run the clinical partnerships office now. I saw your name on a donor filing nobody was supposed to see." Camille. I hadn't heard that name in over a decade, not since college, back when she used to help me study for statistics exams in a library that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet. She'd gone into university administration after graduation. I'd lost track of her the way you lose track of most people from that part of your life. Now, apparently, she was Stephanie's academic advisor, and she'd stumbled onto a filing error that connected my shell entity to the donor account funding the simulation lab. We talked on the phone that night, and she filled in a detail I hadn't fully appreciated. The lab renovation I'd funded wasn't some minor upgrade. It was the reason Stephanie's entire cohort could complete clinical hours on campus instead of driving 40 minutes each way to a partner hospital, something Stephanie had complained about constantly for 2 years without ever knowing who'd fixed it. "She has no idea," Camille said. "None of them do. The donor lines always just said, Anonymous, Denver." I asked her to keep it that way. Old habits. She agreed, reluctantly, and added something I turned over in my head for days afterward. "You know eventually this comes out, right? Paperwork like this always surfaces eventually." I told her I knew. I didn't tell her that some part of me had already decided I didn't mind anymore, that if this marriage was ending anyway, I no longer had a reason to keep hiding what I'd built. I just hadn't figured out yet what showing it would cost me. Stephanie moved fast, faster than I expected. Within a month she was seeing a man named Wallace, who owned a used car dealership on the east side of Denver and drove a demo model off his own lot every few weeks like a costume change. Mutual friends showed me pictures from her social media, a rooftop bar downtown, string lights, a weekend trip to Scottsdale. The caption under one photo read "Finally living," and I remember reading it twice, the way you press on a bruise just to confirm it still hurts. What Stephanie didn't know, and what I only learned later, was that Wallace had a pattern. He'd done this before, swept in during a woman's divorce, dazzled her for a few months with things that looked like stability, then quietly extracted himself once the excitement wore thin and the bills started catching up to him. One of my old co-workers, whose cousin had dated Wallace 2 years earlier, told me the story almost as a warning, though at the time I didn't know what to do with it. A friend of Stephanie's tried to warn her too, apparently, said something about Wallace's business having a reputation among people who worked car auctions in the area. Stephanie brushed it off. She was happy, or at least she looked happy in every photo, and happiness like that doesn't usually listen to warnings. I saw them together exactly once, by accident, at a restaurant downtown. Wallace's phone rang midway through their dinner, and I watched him step outside to take it, his face tightening in the window's reflection. I couldn't hear him, but I could read the shape of the conversation in his shoulders, irritation, then something closer to panic. He said something sharp before hanging up, then stood alone on the sidewalk for almost a full minute before going back inside like nothing happened. I didn't think much of it that night. I know now I should have. The cracks in Wallace's life started showing about 6 weeks after that dinner, though I only heard about it secondhand, the way you hear about weather in a city you used to live in. A repossession truck showed up at his dealership on a Thursday morning, hauling off 2 vehicles from the front row while customers watched from the sidewalk. Someone I used to work with sent me a photo of it, not maliciously, just as a kind of neutral update, the way people do when they know you still have a stake in someone else's unraveling. Not long after, Wallace asked Stephanie to help him out, just for a little while, just until a shipment of inventory cleared and the business stabilized. She agreed, because that's what you do when you love someone and you don't yet understand the shape of the hole they're standing in. What she didn't know, what I only pieced together later through Camille, who'd heard it from a friend in the same social circle, was that Wallace had asked at least 3 other women the exact same favor over the years, phrased almost word for word the same way, and none of them had ever been paid back. Stephanie started pawning jewelry that month. I found out because her sister, still fond of me despite everything, mentioned it in passing, not realizing how it would land. Among the pieces Stephanie let go was a bracelet I'd given her for our 5th anniversary, the same year I'd made my first deposit into that scholarship fund, the same year I'd quietly decided some things mattered more than being seen as generous. I sat with that information for a long time. Not with satisfaction. I want to be clear about that. There was no part of me that felt vindicated watching her scramble to prop up a man who'd shown her exactly who he was and been ignored. Mostly I just felt tired, and a little sad, the way you feel watching someone walk toward a mistake you already made yourself, years ago, in a different kitchen, with a different set of numbers. By early spring, people had started asking me questions I didn't know how to answer honestly. Why didn't you fight for her? Why didn't you show her what she was giving up? One of my closest friends, Malcolm, asked me straight out over beers one night if I'd ever considered just telling Stephanie the truth about my finances, if maybe things would have gone differently. I told him no, and he didn't understand why, so I told him about my father. I was 17 when his construction firm collapsed in 2009, and I watched him spend the last of what little he had left trying to win my mother back, a car he couldn't afford, a trip to Cabo they went on 2 months before the divorce was final, gestures that were less about love and more about proving something to a woman who'd already stopped listening. It didn't work. It never works. All it did was strip away whatever dignity he had left, along with the money, and by the time the divorce was finalized there was nothing left to divide but debt. I decided somewhere in that mess, without fully realizing I was deciding it, that I would never let money become a performance in my own marriage. That if someone stayed with me, it would be because of who I was on an ordinary Tuesday, not because of what I could produce under pressure. I built my whole adult life around that principle, quietly, almost stubbornly, and when Stephanie started measuring me against Priya's husband and his lake house, some old, wounded part of me just went silent instead of arguing. Malcolm didn't say much after I told him that. He just nodded slowly and said maybe silence had cost me more than I realized. I didn't disagree. That night, driving home, I stopped by my father's storage unit, where I still kept his old workbench, and I spent 2 hours restoring a chair he never finished, just to have something to do with my hands. Stephanie's graduation ceremony was scheduled for the 2nd week of May, and I only found out the exact date because Camille told me. Stephanie hadn't invited me. I understood why. We hadn't spoken in months beyond logistics about the house, and there was a very real chance Wallace would be there, whatever was left of him and his business by that point. Camille called me on a Sunday evening, her voice careful in a way that told me this wasn't just a courtesy call. The dean's office had decided to publicly recognize the program's largest anonymous donor at the ceremony, as part of unveiling the newly renovated simulation lab. They wanted to know if I'd be willing to accept that recognition in person, on stage, in front of the graduating class. I said I needed a few days to think about it, which was mostly true, though what I was really doing was sitting with a decision I'd been avoiding since the day I sold that motorcycle. For 2 years I'd protected my privacy like it was armor. Now I had a choice: stay hidden, the way my instincts told me to, or let Stephanie see, for the first time, exactly what I'd built while she was busy deciding I wasn't enough. I thought about my father again, the way I seemed to that whole year, and for once I didn't think about his failures. I thought about a version of this moment where I wasn't proving anything to anyone, where I was simply showing up for something that mattered to me long before it had anything to do with her. I said yes to Camille on a Wednesday night. Afterward, I opened my closet and found a suit I hadn't worn since our wedding, still zipped in its garment bag, hanging alone in a space that used to hold twice as many clothes. I stood there a long time before I touched it, my reflection faint in the dark window behind it, wondering if I was about to do something brave or something I'd regret. The ceremony was held in a university auditorium that still smelled faintly of fresh paint from the renovation. I sat toward the back, out of habit, watching Stephanie's row from a distance as she scanned the crowd more than once, clearly looking for Wallace. He never showed. I learned afterward that he'd spent that entire morning fielding calls from a second repossession company, his business finally collapsing in on itself in real time, several miles away from the one moment Stephanie probably needed him most. Midway through the ceremony, the dean stepped up to introduce the new clinical simulation lab, thanking the program's largest anonymous benefactor for making it possible, and then, for the first time in 2 years, said my name out loud into a microphone. Jude Brooks. I watched Stephanie's head turn from 3 rows away. I watched the exact moment recognition landed on her face, confusion first, then something closer to disbelief, as I stood up from my seat and walked down the aisle toward the stage in a suit she hadn't seen since our wedding day. I didn't look at her as I walked. I couldn't, not yet. On stage, shaking the dean's hand, accepting a small plaque I hadn't asked for and didn't really want, I finally let myself glance out at the crowd. Our eyes met for exactly 1 second. I saw her hand frozen mid-clap, suspended in the air like she'd forgotten what it was for. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. I just held her gaze long enough for her to understand this wasn't a performance, turned back to the dean, and let the moment pass. I don't know what she felt sitting there. I've imagined it 100 different ways since. Shame, regret, maybe just shock. What I know is that for 2 years she'd measured me against men who spent loudly to prove something, and the whole time, the quietest man she knew had already built something that mattered, without once asking her to notice. Stephanie found me in the parking lot afterward, still in her cap and gown, her heels clicking fast against the pavement like she was afraid I'd disappear before she reached me. She asked me why I never told her. Not angrily, quietly, the way you ask a question you're scared of the answer to. I told her the truth. I didn't build any of it for her to see. I started that fund 2 years before our marriage ever cracked, back when I was just a kid from a broken home trying to pay forward something a professor once did for me. It was never a secret meant to punish her. It was just mine, the one thing in my life I'd never let anyone turn into a scoreboard. She stood there for a moment, and I watched something settle behind her eyes. Not quite grief, not quite regret, something closer to recalculation, like she was rebuilding the last 2 years of her life with new information she didn't know how to use yet. She mentioned Wallace, almost involuntarily, said she didn't know where he even was that morning. I didn't ask. I didn't need to. I told her I hoped she'd be okay, and I meant it, without bitterness, the way you can only mean something once you've truly let it go. Then I got in my car and drove off alone, and for the first time in months, the silence in the car didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. My phone buzzed as I pulled out of the lot. A message from Camille. The board wants to name the lab after you. What do I tell them? I looked at the screen for a long moment, then set the phone face down on the passenger seat without answering. Some decisions, I've learned, deserve more than a quick reply. Somewhere behind me, in a building full of new nurses and a lab I'd never officially claimed, Stephanie was starting to understand exactly what she'd walked away from, and exactly what she hadn't. Thanks for watching. Subscribe, like and share for more interesting stories.